Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm happy to continue with your second PCA talk of the year. Despite all the craziness around the world, we managed to still connect online. And for this second PCA talk, I'm happy to welcome John Fleetwood. He will be talking about his topic, actually, about photography and education. And his talk is titled "A Commitment to Understand Different Photography Worlds as a Way to Understand Photography, Education and Photography Models and Context." John Fleetwood is a curator, educator, and director of Photo, a multi-operation platform for the development and promotion for socially engaged photography practices, photographers in critical visual culture in Johannesburg, South Africa. As educator and strategist through Photo, he has facilitated, organized, and supported a range of different education interventions, activities, and organizations. He convenes democraSEE, an award mentorship program for Southern African photographers. Fleetwood works closely with the Centers of Learning for Photography in Africa and other institutions of education. He is also the co-curator of Blurring the Lines for the 2020 edition. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And perhaps just to thank you for this incredible opportunity for including me in the selection panel for the Blurring the Line selection, where I got to meet my other colleagues, Lizanne van Happen and Steve Bisson, which was a great opportunity for me to meet them, but also for us to see incredible work from around the world. And I think it is such an incredible platform that we are able to see each other's work and that we are able to understand perhaps a little bit more from each other. I was particularly happy to see work from Mexico, from India, from Russia. Of course, the photographers thought it's all about them and that they are able to share their work. But actually, I think the main purpose for this is for lecturers to be able to see what other institutions are doing and to get a sense of benchmarking, how they see and position themselves, what are the kinds of methodologies and languages that are applied all across the world. And so I think as an educator, it is really important to have a look at Blurring the Lines. And so congratulations for that. Many of you would know that there were 151 applications coming from 38 participating institutions, and that is quite incredible. And so really it was my honor to be part of that panel. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen if you guys will allow me, and let me see how I'm going to do that without losing myself. Right. Yeah, so I suppose tonight I'm going to present some positions and to speak succinctly and congruently for me, to speak longer than 5 minutes is a very hard task. So instead of speaking very succinctly in the name of diversity, I will make some points that you hopefully can tie together. It's called active listening. So even though your screens might be off, I hope you're concentrating. I really like the idea that we can have some questions afterwards, or even if there are any urgent questions in between, please feel free to stop me. Yeah. Right, so I have to click. All right, so the overall theme this year for this year's award was commitment. I was thinking about this idea that photography as a language is essentially a structure to think with, to understand the world with. I'm interested in the conventions of the structure. I was wondering what the effect of COVID-19 would be on the world. While we believe that everybody was and is online, access to the internet is yet to become a human right. And so we need to understand that for many, it was a time of silence or of darkness, if you want. While we believe that everybody was regulated to stay in their homes, many do not have shelter. While we believe that we would find a vaccine, not everyone would want to take it and not everybody would get it anyway. While we have had clear skies and water, we are still unable to understand our world as a big organism that is dependent on its smaller parts like us and other animals. We photograph at moments of great excitement, the urgencies of our times. What is it that we can see when things are heightened, uncertain, and unsure? What is it that we cannot see during the time of the mundane, the time of the ordinary? And what happens when these urgencies slip into our mundane? COVID is in fact an urgency that is troubled by the mundane. Our minds are still trying to understand this discrepancy. It has converged the mundane into urgency. Questions of systemic racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia. These
Devozione
things,
no, devozione non è la comprensione, è tipo una dedizione, un'attenzione.
I think that's Steve. Hi, Steve. I can hear you. So questions of systemic racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, these things that we've known for a long time, have converged with now being part of our urgency. But the urgency has also converged with the mundane, and that even though we live in the most unusual world of lockdown and isolation, we have reached a saturation of understanding it as an urgency. So I would really like you guys to have a look at this and please think what this could be. Of course, it's an image. And of course, it's an image that I'm sharing with you from Johannesburg. And yes, I'm the author of this photograph. I took it recently when I was in the Soutpansberg, a mountain range in the north of South Africa, close to the border of Zimbabwe. It was the first time in 7 months that I left Johannesburg in my house after a very strict COVID lockdown. What you are looking at is, of course, a rock drawing or a rock painting. According to our guide, the rock painting was made by the Khoisan people. The Khoisan people are the Sun, the hunters and the gatherers, and the Khoikhoi or the Kuku, who are the herders of Southern Africa. Not only are they the first peoples of Southern Africa, but it is estimated that they once were the largest group of humans in the world. Archaeologists have estimated that hunter-gatherers have been around in Southern Africa for approximately 22,000 or between 11 and 22,000 years. That's a long time ago. And to help you to understand that, I've plotted some dates so that we can just deduct. So 1830 was roughly the time when Africa was colonized. 1950 was roughly the time when Africa was decolonized. But of course, we know that's an ongoing process. So imagine 2020, 2020 years back to reach zero, and then imagine further 11,000 years. And that gives us a sense of how long we have been on this area. As you can hear, I have to close the door. Please excuse me. It's also quite hot. So, central to the Sun, these hunter-gatherers and herders' religious life is the medicine dance. It's also called the trance dance. The Sun may name these dances after animals or other instruments of power. The medicine dance facilitates contact between the human, the animal, and the spiritual world, and is substantially the same among different groups. Intimately connected to this dance is the idea of the supernatural potency, the power, named the Dom or the Kung. I will spare you my further interpretation of the click sounds of the Sun. As the Sun seeth, potency is present in certain animals in medicine songs and in humans to whom it was given by a higher spirit. Some people say that the nom, this potency, this power, resides at the base of the spine and in the lower abdomen, where it lies latent until activated by the rhythmic dancing and enchanting of medicine songs. The activated potency is said to boil and rise at the spine to the base of the head while you dance. So with intense dancing, this potency comes up to your head, inducing a deep altered state of consciousness. During these states, the shamans are believed to harness the potency of animals and to leave their own bodies to travel in other realms, to cure the sick, to control animal herds, and to bring rain. Other rituals that are closely associated with social relations, with the well-being of the land and with the hunting success and puberty rites. Rock engravings and paintings are thought to depict supernatural potency and power, elements of medicine, dances, rain-making rites, and the visions of transformations of shamans. Such images may, in some instances, directly or obliquely refer to the rich symbolism that surrounds young people's rites of transition among the sun. Importantly, the rock face on these images were made, where these images were made is thought in some instances to represent the boundary between the physical and the spiritual world, because some images of animals and people were painted in such a way that they appear to enter or exit cracks or step into the rock face. This was particularly interesting for me around photography and how we think around the surface. Sun rock engravings and paintings across the subcontinent are broadly similar in content, but there are significant regional differences. I thought how such images may, in some instances, directly or obliquely refer to the rich symbolism that surrounds young people's rites of transition amongst the sun. I thought of the delicate processes that are involved when young creators express themselves as a way to become accountable citizens of this world. It's a process of shamanistic proportions. I was struck with this belief that the supernatural activated potency is to boil and rise up the spine to the base of the head, inducing deep altered states of consciousness that finally leaves the body to travel to other realms to cure the sick, control animal herds, and bring the rain. In fact, that is exactly what our world needs. So as education institutions, we now know that lecturers have to dance with their students for these messages to boil up until they are ready to leave into this world. Trance dances did not happen regularly. They happened at times when there was great need, sickness, failure of the land, failure of survival. And this for me is really important. Starting to think around what these images really depict. So the one aspect that we look at is this idea that when we look at rock paintings, that we think that we are looking at a depiction of the truth. But actually, what we are looking at is an experience, a shamanistic experience, an experience that leaves the body behind and becomes part of a greater realm. And I was interested in this idea around this theme of commitment and how we can see this as a commitment to understand. So one of the aspects that really intrigued me around this idea of a rock painting and how it can be a photograph, but also how it possesses the possibility for us to start to think around how young people move into the world, is by starting to think around these images as messages to another realm. And I thought that these become very, very clear when we start to look at some of the prize winners. So Ragnar Arnmarik from University of Applied Science in Europe in Berlin. We can see the supernatural in the surreal and the absurd. we can see the idea of failure of the world in the circle of life. She doesn't only deal with the topics of failure in her work, but also how we incorporate ideas of courage and vulnerability. Similar to the shamanistic experience that young people have, Tembikosi Glatswayo, the market for a workshop in Johannesburg, turns the space where he grew up, a place of violence, a tavern where a lot of alcohol abuse might have happened, into a creative space. He turns it into his studio. He starts to photograph and creates a certain kind of energy that boasts out of his head into another realm. The surface that he works with is one similar to the idea of the rock, and that the small bends and creases in the rock become part of the surface. It's the work of Riti Sengupta from National Institute of Design in Gandhinagar in India, whose potency writes about these issues of saving the land. It's an issue that she began to realize that the fight for the land is not merely a demand for territory, that it lies much deeper and essentially a fight for social identity. I'm going to briefly tell you some of the ideas that I have. Maybe you can tie these down together. So one of the things that Photo does as a platform in Johannesburg, based in Johannesburg, is that we work with a number of different institutions all across the continent. We started off by doing a survey of photography training or photography education initiatives on the continent in 2016 and worked through 140 organizations, looked at their curriculum, looked at their facilities, looked at some of the student work, and then plotted a map of 40 institutions that we believe were important institutions that would be able to, with very limited resources, make an impact on the continent. And subsequently, we have set up the Centers of Learning for Photography in Africa, which is a network based of 11 members all across the continent that are having regular interactions to share curriculum, to share projects. We recently started on a new project that we will be doing during November, December, January, but also the distribution of a newsletter that is a very important document that helps different institutions get a good understanding of what are some of the debates in gender on the continent. And so most of these contributions come from members, but of course we augment it with commissioned. And this document, this newsletter, then becomes something that also talks about our joint activities, and that starts to build a sense of belonging amongst institutions that oftentimes cannot compete, I suppose, with large institutions, but often depends on one or two very strong individuals that make things happen. democraSEE is an award for Southern African photographers that we've run 3 editions over the last 3 years. It also wants to bring together not just photographers, but also works with the idea of curators working with photographers. And so the idea of building curators as a collective that work with singular photographers. We've been doing workshops all across the continent. Here's a list of some of the places that we've been to. And then we run very short and longer term workshops or masterclasses that I thought might be interesting to talk about. So the 10-10, which is the short one-day intervention, is this idea of bringing together photographers on a oops to bring together photographers that can share their ideas. And oftentimes these photographers are people that have been working in different fields. So you have very informal and very formal photographers, meaning people that have learned in formal and informal institutions. And opposed to this one-day sharing event, we also have, for instance, 10 Queer. The 10 Queer was a project that we run in 2018, 2019. And so the format for me becomes quite important. And instead of having 10 photographers, the project is divided into 10 or 5 experts working together with 5 photographers. And it was, of course, around questions of queer social practice. And so these 5 experts were writers, academics, sociologists, people that had particular knowledge fields that came together with the photographers to share ideas and to get them to understand what some of the academic writing had been around these subjects, but also to engage in a kind of activist way around their work in a way to steer them into certain debates and certain discussions. This is some of the gatherings, and I think for a time that we are busy with now, it's the opposite somehow. So this sense of intimacy, of standing together and being able to read out of one book is not something that that we are dealing with at the moment. But so the idea is to also bring young people in contact with academics and delivering at the end of the day one project as a collective. Platform Africa was a publication of Aperture, which we issued in 2017 with, of course, through Aperture, which was a document that spoke about all the institutions operating on the continent and some of the important photography activities that are happening. 5 Photographers was an exhibition, which was a tribute meant to David Goldblatt, who was by far the most important photographer for South Africa and has developed an incredible body of work that I think has really made very deep marks in the understanding of what social documentary means for South Africa. I'm going to show you some of the projects from quite a long time ago, but I do think that these are quite important because it helps us to understand some of the conditions that we work with. So this was a project when I was still the head.
John, I have a question. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
I was wondering, when you are matching up the experts and the photographers, the 5 and 5,
yes.
Are you then specifically looking for artists that have a specific interest in, for instance, sociology or history, or how do you match? How do you match them?
Well, I think that the process has always been quite organic, and that people come from very particular interests, but that it's also a personality match, and that oftentimes that determines how people start to work with each other. In many previous projects, we tried to match projects prior to these engagements, and somehow that never works as well as when people choose themselves who they would like to work with. And I think in this particular group, it was really interesting to see how people had very organic kind of links with each other. And often, and I think these things are so important. Often it happened because people would get lifts with each other. So it's because they would drive together and they would start to speak to each other beforehand. And so I think that's very much part of the process of education, is kind of creating these kind of very informal links between professionals and people that can draw people into conversations.
Yes, thank you.
I'd like to continue with this, the Maputo Heritage Project, which was quite a large-scale project that we did when I was still the director of the Market Photo Workshop, which is a photography school, gallery, and project space. And so the project started off with our interest in looking at Makwateng, which was one of the spaces that was forcibly removed. So forced removals in South Africa basically meant that in the 1950s, the apartheid regime decided to remark certain areas, and within this demarcation, black areas were now called white areas, which meant that the black population had to resettle in other spaces. And of course, there were a lot of resistance against this. What is interesting around this is that the Makwateng perhaps was never as well known in South Africa as some of the other spaces where forced removals did happen. And in Johannesburg, for instance, there's the very well-known Sapphire Town and District 6 in Cape Town. But Makwateng, which is in a smaller town on the west of Johannesburg, was not so known. And literally, it was bulldozed down and a new suburb was built on top of it exclusively for white people. As we worked in this area, we got to know that people reference Makwateng and that we started to build a history with some of the local people to try and find out a little bit more. And through the tradition of oral history, we asked people for comment. And we had a large town gathering of typically elder people that came to give us an understanding of what actually happened in Makwateng. And so the Makwateng Heritage Project then existed of two parts. In the one area, it was the mapping of this historically removed area and refinding, the particular areas that were there, some of the citizens where they were staying, but at the same time linking up younger generation photographers with some of the older citizens to also kind of speak about loss of history and the importance of oral history and how photography can make inroads in that. And then, of course, there were evening screenings that happened to also bring in some of the youth. Another project that we had done was a project with Akona Kenkru's work. It was called Society. And I think the importance here is how to bring the work of young photographers to a community of young photographers. So the community of Soweto is quite far removed from the city center of Johannesburg. And so often there's a question around what is the center and what is the periphery. And a lot of the photography exhibitions would happen in the city center. Very seldomly, they would go to townships. And one of our projects was then to see how we can inject photography into these communities. And we chose the work of Akona, who was dealing with skateboarders. And so we set up this wallpaper exhibition in a little community hall that was in Soweto as a way to also bring the local population to start to think about this. And so the point that I really would like to make is this question around how do we engage with different communities in the kind of photography work that is necessary. This is just a very simple exhibition that we did in 2012. It was also an exhibition trying to get audiences to understand the multiple processes and trying to invite the audience to become the curators. So we had this information set that helped people to understand what the photographs were about, and then gave the audience the chance to curate their own exhibition in setting up these pictures. And so they had to start to articulate ideas of why they would match certain pictures and how those would work together. Okay, so I'm hoping that this is now a time where people can start to ask me questions, and where we can start to have a conversation in a broader frame.
I have a technical question, John. I'm sorry, not the most interesting one, but I'm wondering, how did those photographs that people could hang on the wall, how did they stay on the wall? What was the system you work with?
let's see if there's a picture that shows it better. So there we go. You will see that there are magnetic strips on the back of these, and these were boards that that would do it. It was quite inexpensive at the time, and we were able to take this exhibition to 5 or 6 different places.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose what I'm trying to show is kind of diversity of impulses, to see how we have started to work in different educational areas, so that people have a better understanding of, I suppose, the frame in where we operate.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. I mean, and it's really nice to see how projects are developed with communities and young artists. And I remember a conversation you and me we had when we start talking about the conference that we will have at the end of the month about formal, informal, and non-formal education in Africa, which I think is a topic that I mean we probably can talk later a little bit more. But since we are an institution, an academic institution, I would like to start with a question about what is the most important learning experience that you probably have encountered by doing these projects with young photographers, communities, and other professionals?
Yeah, so I suppose the best way to describe it is that I think education of photography is not linear, and that it's accumulative, and that we build our skill set from various kind of interactions that we have. Some of them might be in educational spaces, but a lot of them are not. And so our ideas about the world and our ideas about how we think about the world have probably been set through kind of various interactions, socialized through quite a number of different interactions, friends, Facebook, social media. And so when you come to a learning institution, you come not with an empty plate, you come with quite a specific set of skills and understanding of the world. And then you have to learn photography as a language. And you probably already have ideas around that. And so for me, the principle is that in context of the South Africa in particular, but certainly in context of the rest of the continent, I think that informal and non-formal education is very much better suited, I think, as a way of getting across information. And I'm wondering if it's not a better option across the world, as I'm speaking to educators at the moment. So here are some of the concerns. If we are interested in taking young people and taking them through this shamanistic experience, where through this engagement that they will boil this knowledge of photography and eventually they will be able to give it to the world, I'm wondering how the formal institutions, and particularly the conventions in formal institutions, allow for that. Allow for passion, allow for a commitment to certain processes. And I think so that's part of my questioning. So in my own experience, the formal institutions in South Africa had also very particular histories, and those histories are very much intertwined with a colonial system, with a system of apartheid. And so those systems were problematic in many ways. And I think many of our institutions today struggle with that we work with histories where institutions have been set up in ways, and it's very hard to change such large institutions because of funding realities and so on. And so this idea of non-formal institutions, and perhaps the definition can help. So a non-formal institution would be an institution that perhaps have got some structure to their curriculum, but does not necessarily have accreditation with whatever authority or regulator there is, whereas informal education would not necessarily have structure and it might be quite ad hoc. And so I think that a balance of these different ways of education is really a very interesting way of starting to think around education. If we start to think around particularly how to work in South Africa, and perhaps also institutions of privilege around the world, that the moment that you go to an institution, already there's been a number of exclusions that have happened. And so you join an institution and immediately you become part of an institution of privilege. And I suppose what is cut out there is a question and understanding of community. Which communities are represented and which communities are not? Which communities have voice in these institutions? And I think those are some of the really hard questions that we can possibly assist by engaging with photographers, perhaps in a more non-formal matter. So this non-formal matter, meaning that there are all kinds of organizations set up in any big city that deals with different ways of photography and maybe exposure of photographer to various different spaces might give them access to different kinds of collectives or communities that might inform their work. So I think going back to my experiences, education in South Africa, certainly at the time when I was the director of the Market Photo Workshop, which was the early 2000s, had many exclusions. And so you started to teach at a university where the majority of Black people did not have access to because of previous education that were not accredited into that system. And so there's exclusions in a great way. Today, of course, that has shifted, it's changed. But at the same time, we have to think of economy and accessibility, people paying for their courses, and the ability to not just do their work, but also have experiences as a human being in society, and how finances play a role in those kinds of interactions. And so I think it is really important to think how we bring different communities into the learning system, so that when photographers have studied, that they have not only got to know photography, but that they had to deal with different communities that they otherwise would not deal with.
That actually made me think about a second question, because you mentioned communities, and since you have the privilege to work with communities, directly with communities, I find that very, I really like that process of really developing the project with the photographers that somehow have some expertise and they want to share it with the communities. And how do you manage to, maybe educate is not the right term to talk about, educate the community, but how they could be probably more sensitive about the process of working with photographers, because I guess that they're not probably, they don't know much about photography, and they have to trust the medium to really embark themselves into this process of maybe trusting the photographers in the work that they imagine and they envision with the community. How do you manage that trust?
Well, I think that the first point is that any community, and I can imagine, for instance, in Paris, what kinds of different communities they could be. But coming back to South Africa, any community certainly must have suspicion about what photography will do or can do with them. And so that, I think, is the start off point. It's a declaration of intention. And I think that it is firstly for the community to understand and be part of the project as a choice, but also for them to understand what they can get out of it. And so these interactions have got two sides. And for me, that would be very interesting to find out how those kinds of interactions, for instance, in Europe or in the States, can work. What are the suspicions that communities have around photography and photographers coming to them? What are the interactions that they already expect that will be the end result? And I think dealing directly with those are quite important. And so in some cases, we have literally signed agreements where we start off with a range of workshops where we would invite the different communities, photographers, curators. So at the moment, we often work with curators as being these intermediaries between the photographers and communities. Basically setting out some kind of framework for understanding. And I think it's frank talk. It's, putting out there what community can really gain from a process of engagement, and sometimes what the risks are of being part of a project. So we work with sometimes quite sensitive communities. So we had a project with sex workers, and one of the most vulnerable parts of this project became the clients of the sex workers, because they were not necessarily signed in to the overall project. And that's an interesting space where the vulnerability shifted somehow from one space to another space. I think it's always a space where one needs to negotiate and have frank talk, but one also needs to understand, what these processes are about. And I would imagine that when individual photographers go out and start to photograph in different communities or in different setups, they too have to go through these processes. I think we all, at all institutions, teach this. You have to negotiate, you have to make clear what your intention is. There's always the question around how you show your work, how some of the participants of a project might have agreement about what selection is shown. And so it starts to think around photography as a different kind of practice, perhaps to some degree. And I think that's perhaps a question that we have to ask in general for photography, is this assumption that I may photograph without consent. And I think that there's a lot of thinking that we probably need to go through in general around that. But I think that these processes are best set up through frank and open discussion.
So thank you, John. I was wondering, coming from an art institution from the Netherlands, what do you see as the role for art institutions when it comes to giving opportunities to African artists? Where do you see things going wrong, and where do you see opportunities?
Well, I think to speak about African artists is often quite difficult, because people could be at different parts of development of their careers. And I think that would be the first thing to look out for, is to find people that have, that have had some exposure, that have had some kind of engagement. And so that when they land up in a new space, either virtually or in physical space, that they already have something, some confidence and some standing for their own knowledge to grow from. Because I think often what happens is there are exposure for African photographers from Africa that not carefully curated around their own experience field. And so lived experience become a critical aspect in that. The ability to critically engage with the medium and understand the medium is, of course, very, very important. I'll give you one example that I worked on many years ago. But there was a project that sent a photographer from Johannesburg to New York for a year residency, and it was the most incredible opportunity. Everybody was really excited about it, but it really didn't work. And the basic principle was exactly what I've mentioned just now. I think we failed to understand how many layers of experience is engaged or is included in this process of residency or of exchange, and that sometimes those are quite overwhelming for photographers. So I think there's a big question around how institutions work together. And so for me, best practice is often when institutions collaborate with each other to make sure that photographers are able to go into certain spaces rather than working with individual photographers. Making sure that there's some kind of infrastructure that supports the photographer when they go to another space, so that they are not on their own, and so that certain things can also be moderated. Other than these questions around how you land up in a new space where there might be practical difficulties for you to operate and understand, there's also major questions around what the role and function of photography is. And so there's this assumption that people speak photography as one language, and it's not. There are many photographies, and that photographers in Johannesburg use photography perhaps for slightly different reasons. And there's a different convention and art historical socialization around what photography does than I think for other photographers. And I think this becomes very, very obvious when you start to look at what social media has been doing. This assumption that we're a global world, and that people present themselves in ways that looks as if they are global. But if you look very carefully to posts, people also go home, and that's where some of those very specific markers come to the fore.
Thank you, John. Well, do you also think that because what you have said is also that I think you were basically talking about equality and about power, and how you can make sure that as an institution you try at least to be as equal as possible with the photographers you work with and have an equal relationship, so that they also have the power to stand up to you and to develop themselves and to have a feeling of safety to work in an environment that is new to them. So when you mention that, then these informal institutions or these informal education platforms, then they become very important, right? Or these maybe collectives or informal gatherings of artists who are joining forces and trying to help each other, right?
Exactly. So I think that there are a range of different institutions that can play, if you want to call it intermediaries, that help photographers to somehow navigate different layers of their engagement. So, you know, if you've never done photography before, and kind of imagine that, you know, in the world, perhaps outside of Europe, the majority of people do not have any arts education at school, and so to choose to become a photographer usually comes at a later stage for somebody. And so, how do you navigate a career when you perhaps do not have access to an institution? You start to hang out with photographers. And that's the very simple, basic explanation, perhaps, how we can think about intermediary institutions. They allow people to hang out and be in spaces that they feel confident and that they can trust, and that they can learn a certain set of knowledge and skills that will enable them to have more confidence to now start to deal with more stringent academic learning environments. And I think it's really important And so in the case of Johannesburg, I think that these centers of learning become quite important. And that on the one hand, any institution offers a kind of a power structure for any student that will enter a space. It's on their terms, and a student comes in and registers, and that sets up a certain chain of events that are somehow or somewhat inevitable, and that one needs to negotiate and navigate from the beginning. And I think what you've mentioned is so important, is that no matter how we intend to project our institutions as being institutions that are fair and equal to the photographers and to the students, they never are, because of the basic infrastructure that goes into these institutions. And so to get people to really feel at comfort and at ease, I think it's all these other circles around institutions, intermediary institutions, that allow photographers to build up confidence and to gain experience so that they would feel comfortable.
Hi, John.
Steve, hi.
Sorry, before my voice interrupt you.
It's okay. I can see it's because of the yellow clouds in your background, probably.
Can you see the northern lights?
It is.
So I was just willing to say thank you for your short lecture. I feel it's difficult to focus on terms so broad such as education, community, right? And to keep focus on our thinking. Sometimes I feel like these words are a bit inflated, and when you have a word that is difficult to find the right definition for a word, then that word doesn't work anymore. We need new words. So this is, I think, is a challenge when it comes to education, because probably neither of us has a same definition for what is education. So that word's not working anymore. And the same is community. And the same, of course, even more, is photography. Photography is a word that doesn't make sense anymore, because every one of us have a different definition. So words without proper definition are words that are not helpful. So I was just willing to share briefly an experience, hopefully I had with an African. I don't know if it was a photographer, an artist, or whatever. But anyway, I think maybe it will help to place this debate about education in a country such as Africa, or similar country as Africa, in a different perspective. So in 2015, there was an expo, international expo in Milano about food and sustainability. It's the expo is a giant moment of investment coming from all over the world in a single place. And it was about food. And I was commissioned to make a book. This is the book, 2015. I'm sure you can see. But anyway, I made an open call, John. And I got a project from a person whose name is Roberto Galante. And this guy is a project manager for a cultural association working in Maputo, Mozambique. And what this guy has been doing for the past years is working with the people living and working in the landfill of Maputo. And so he applied to the call, sending few pictures of this man, a father, who lives actually with his family and kids in the landfill of Maputo. So these people basically live in the landfill, and they make up their living selecting trash every day. They wake up, they go to the trash, they live, they make love in the trash, they eat trash. That's the life they do. but so they work with these people and they may organize courses. I don't know if it's education, but anyway, they organize workshops, right? And they give to these people cameras, and they give a chance to these people to somehow, I don't know, tell their stories. These people will never become artists. These people will never become photographers. These people will never exit the landfill, basically. And I got like 3 submissions from some students of this workshop from the landfill of Maputo, from this very important international call. And one of this project was incredibly amazing. It was truly outstanding, you know. I don't know how this man, you know, who they gave the camera to this man. He took some pictures with the dump. I'm afraid I cannot show you. Maybe here. I don't know if you can see it, but well, I think with the northern lights it's a bit of a problem. But anyway, his name is Fabião Carlitos Checo, and the title of the project was Smoke, the landfill of Maputo. Incredible pictures, you know. And I decided to publish his work in the book, in this very important international catalog with big names of photographers. And there was this guy, you know, in the catalog who's actually lives in the landfill of Maputo. And then I sent copies of this book, of course, to the association, and I sent, please give these copies to this man. And I was thinking, this man, you know, sitting in the trash and flipping through the book. And for me, until today, this is something that, okay, makes sense to my job, you know. So connecting a little bit to the question of Lisanne, so what can we do as institution, you know, to promote African art or helping, you know, people finding maybe a career in art section? Well, I don't know. I think what we should do, we should maybe try to work and give a chance to people that will never have a chance even to access a normal photography workshop. And this is the first thing. The other second thing is what photography is for, you know. Right now, actually, I should be in another call where they're launching a book I've published yesterday, basically, where we are talking about, it's a book about pollution in northern Italy. It's like a catalog of worst case scenario of pollution in northern Italy. And I'm talking about this because one of the things we face is the lack of open data. Why I'm talking about open data in Africa? I think that what institutions that have money could do is try to get access to data about any kind of urgencies, you know, we might face, and help to reduce this distance in between, you know, images and data. That's, for me, is one of the things that would make sense to education in the future. What we can do with our, you know, that nice image you have shown us about the rocks painting, you know, it's simply telling us about that we are an instrumental animal, John. So since our early phases, we've been using tools, you know, maybe to paint rocks. Now we use cameras. That's the same thing. It's just keeping up with this long history of using tools. There is no man without tools. That's basically what philosophy teaches. So we have to use differently the tool today, the medium. That, I believe, is another thing that we could suggest when it comes to education. What kind of different use we can make with this little funny thing, which is a camera, you know. So yeah, I was just willing to highlight this through this experience I had with this association working in the landfill of Maputo, highlighting these two possible direction of thinking and working, which is one is, you know, engaging with this level of community, without thinking that these people might become artists. Basically we are just working at that makes sense of being the community, and just giving them opportunities, and that's it basically. And the other thing is, I think in education is we have to start to understand how we can use differently the medium. And probably I see a possibility in the connection between image and open data. Otherwise, all our theories about using photography in documenting and telling urgencies will not make any sense if we don't have access to data, basically. And that's my experience I have here in Italy in telling about pollution in the northern Italy. When you get data, you cannot do. Data are very poor quality. So we need data, we need access to real information, and we need to spread real information. Otherwise, it's just like, poverty porn in a way, you know what I mean? So we need to, even as educators, we need to have a higher expectation of our job, of what we can do out there. So sorry if it took too long, but I felt your introduction was very provocative. So
yeah, so Steve, it's a strange example, this idea of somebody living on a landfill and creating photographs around it. But it's also not that strange, because there are such incredible opportunities that can change people's lives. And so for me, there's always that thinking around what people can make with small opportunities. So I suppose the first point for me is that this notion that Africa is one big space, we have to kind of debunk, because it's not. I'm an African, and I have had a lot of certain privileges that came my way, and there's a sizable middle class in South Africa, as in Nigeria, as in Ethiopia, as in elsewhere. So this idea of what we think of when we say African, what comes to mind, I think is quite important for me, and that we think about how we navigate that. So to go back to some of the questions that Azan asked, how do we get photographers into spaces so that we can, how do we invite photographers from the continent into spaces of Europe and of the States? I think it's happening, and it's happening quite rapidly. And I think that there are the development of African photography, or photographers from Africa, over the last 5-10 years has been incredible. And there are really a lot of image makers that are doing really important work. And not only photographers, but photography education institutions have developed. And there's a lot of professionalization around those. Universities have certainly improved. So I think that the question around how we sometimes get to a person that is eager, looking for an opportunity, we need to set off with how that can make impact in their lives. And I think it's a case-by-case answer. I would very, very much doubt if I can give a global answer. But one thing that is really important for me is that photography is not always art. Photography is, as a medium, can be something that we gather knowledge with. And it's a way for us to engage with our society, to think about our society in ways that will help us to be able to be more productive in other areas. And so when we then invite photographers, we have to really think around what their practice is about, how they see their practice. And I think this idea of photographing myself as a way of dealing with certain issues that are around me, as a way of expressing my identity, as a way of gathering knowledge of my community. Those things are really important. And often they don't start off with the idea of somebody wanting to develop or create art. it can develop into that. But I think we need to have quite an open scope for that. And I fully agree with you when it comes to internet, when it comes to data. It is one of the hardest problems. And COVID, from March until June, that was the biggest problem for me working with the photographers that I used to work with, is that people did not have internet, or internet was super unreliable, and they had to work from phones rather than laptops, and it was really hard. But people are quite amazing in how they get around these things, and so I think a lot of problem solving happened during that time. A lot of the people started to realize that they can to put money together and start some kind of more reliable internet service. And so I think by now it is much easier. But one of the most critical aspects for us in terms of fundraising for our projects had been that we need to ensure that people have internet, that people have data, that people are able to communicate. Otherwise, our projects mean nothing at this particular moment. But it goes further, because once people have got data, they need a space to work. And oftentimes, there are no public spaces. So during COVID, what was a big problem is that people had to work from small houses where families and extended families share the same space. It's quite hard to concentrate on a lecture when people are running around. And so those were some of the difficulties, and I think those difficulties are everywhere. People we are just getting used to understanding those.
Well, thank you, John. I think as you said, and also Lisanne and Steve said, I think it's a big topic that I hope that by the end of the month, with the conference that we're doing with the European Cultural Center, that will be a great opportunity, because we're going to spend 2 days really talking about, education and all these different aspects and issues that have been raised tonight. So I'm going to just share with everyone the link for the conference, because the program was published today. And of course, we encourage everyone to come and join us for, they're going to be two days. So on Friday, the curators, they're going to be talking to the finalists and winners. And on Saturday, we're going to be talking with different professionals, but also curators, institutions, academics about the topic. And the idea is I don't think we're going to find an answer. I don't think we're going to find definitions. But I think we're going to just put ideas out there, and just maybe we're hoping that things start moving on, And well, thank you everyone for coming in. Thank you, John, for your presentation. I think it's a good, it was a good starting point to keep working and thinking how we're going to move forward with photography and education.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Interesting time. Thank you, Lisanne.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here.
Yeah.